Jesus will not return to the earth. That is, until the Antichrist sits in the temple of God in Jerusalem and ends the Jewish temple worship. But before that worship can even begin or the temple be built, one thing is missing: a red heifer, which is a type of red cow. The Temple Institute in Israel has prepared temple vessels and vestments for the priests. 500 from the tribe of Levi have been trained for temple offerings. And in our last episode, we discussed how a tent or tabernacle may be utilized instead of a temple, temporarily until the temple is able to be built, and how it could be set up in a day. But none of that matters until Israel breeds a perfect red cow. You see, the third temple, Jerusalem, requires a red heifer prior to any offerings. How soon might one be ready? Well, the experts at the Temple Institute say a red heifer could be ready by fall of this year. Yes, possibly that soon. But why is a red heifer necessary for the temple? It doesn't seem to make any sense, does it? The Jewish rabbis don't think it makes any sense either. They term this type of biblical requirement a chok, or a biblical law for which there is no apparent logic. In fact, the Jewish sages say that although Solomon had great wisdom, this was the one thing that even he could not understand. And Jews to this day are confused by this strange requirement to sacrifice a cow in order to become clean. Now, although even Solomon couldn't understand the sacrifice of a red heifer, by the time we are finished with this video, I assure you that you will understand it, because we have two things that Solomon didn't have: the New Testament and the Holy Spirit to interpret it for us. You will understand both the historic fulfillment of the red heifer and, more importantly, the future fulfillment when this red cow and its earth-changing sacrifice take place. In Judaism, in order to purify a person who has become ritually contaminated, the only solution was to be washed with fresh water mixed with the ashes of a burnt red heifer. I told you this was a strange command. And a priest absolutely cannot officiate in the temple when they are ritually unclean. Nor can the physical building of the temple or even a tabernacle tent be sanctified unless the blood ceremony of the heifer, which we will discuss later in this video, takes place. So these are the two reasons that even if Israel negotiated the right to build a temple or set up a tabernacle on the Temple Mount, they won't do it. Not until they have a red heifer, because the temple and the priests would both be unclean from a Jewish perspective. So before official sanctioned sacrifices can begin on the Temple Mount or anywhere else, a red heifer sacrifice will have to take place, and in order for that to happen, a kosher red heifer has to be found. Here is what Numbers says about those who remain unclean and defile the tabernacle. Anyone who touches a corpse, the body of a man who has died, and does not purify himself, defiles the tabernacle of the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from Israel. You can see why having a red heifer is so important to the Jews. Let's say that again. Before Jesus can return, official Jewish sacrifices have to be taking place so that the Antichrist can terminate them. And before that can happen, a red heifer has to be sacrificed. It's an essential sign needed prior to the Great Tribulation and the Antichrist, and of course before the return of Jesus. And finding a kosher red heifer, however, is easier said than done. You see, in the entire history of Israel, from Moses to the present day, there have only been 9 kosher red heifers. The last one was sacrificed around 60 AD, and its ashes lasted about 300 years, but then ran out. So for 1700 years, the Jews have felt they are ritually unclean, and they are desperate for a heifer to make them clean again. Because of that, in the last 25 years, a very impassioned search has been taking place to find one. More on that in a second, but first, let's take a moment to discuss what this ritually unclean stuff is all about. Unclean is not an issue of sin. It is better thought of as not having access to God. If you are Jewish and ritually clean, then think of it as having an open door to the Father. But if you are unclean, think of the door as being closed. The ashes of the red heifer, mixed in with fresh water, gives a Jew this cleanliness and access to the Father. A major way that someone becomes unclean is by coming in contact with a dead body. Now, this contact not only includes touching a dead body, but also walking over a grave of a dead body or even being in the same building as a dead body. From a Jewish perspective, just about everyone who has ever been in a hospital has been in the presence of a dead body, so most Jews on the planet are ceremonially unclean in this way. And you can see this type of uncleanliness isn't sin, it's just a closing of the door, closing of access to the Father. And for the Christian, removing this uncleanliness is a type or picture of what Jesus already did for us, because we were all dead and had no access to the Father until Jesus died on the cross. He opened the door for us, but more on that in a little bit. Now, if you'd like to see an example of this red heifer purification from the New Testament, let's look at the Gospel of John. Now, the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. How are those Jews purifying themselves? By the ashes of a red heifer. Notice this was taking place prior to the Passover. This is a clue because to this day, Jews celebrate the Sabbath of the cow, or Shabbat Parah, 2 weeks prior to each Passover. During this Sabbath, they read appropriate passages from the Old Testament about the red heifer. These are ancient texts that are read on this day to remind Jews, back in the Bible times at least, to go to Jerusalem and purify themselves prior to the feast. That is what we saw happening in John's Gospel. Today, however, these passages simply remind the Jews they are unclean, and this adds to the pressure and the desire for a red heifer. Sadly, great numbers of Jews are now also becoming ceremonially unclean because of the coronavirus pandemic. Look at the vast numbers who are entering hospitals or having family members die at home. So the current conditions are driving Jews toward finding a red heifer as quickly as possible also. And once they have one and sacrifice it, the pressure to begin sacrifices on the Temple Mount will be incredible. That pressure isn't there yet, but once they have the ashes of the red heifer, it will become overwhelming. This is also a key point worth repeating. The pressure to build the temple and start sacrifices right now in Israel is almost zero because they can't. They don't have a red heifer, but once they get one, that pressure will become irresistible. Now, we actually have determined a possible date when the red heifer sacrifice might happen, and we'll discuss that later in the video. You will be able to mark your calendar and see if we were correct. But before we do, we need to examine the biblical texts about red heifers because you will learn the secret that Solomon couldn't figure out. The first text is found in Numbers chapter 19. This is the statute of the law that the Lord has commanded. Tell the people of Israel to bring you a red heifer without defect, in which there is no blemish, and on which a yoke has never come. God commanded Moses and Aaron to find a red heifer with very specific requirements to be sacrificed. It had to be without defect or blemish, and on one where a yoke was never placed. The rabbis, not surprisingly, have defined these simple restrictions extremely rigidly with their man-made laws in the Mishnah. The rabbis have defined without defect as meaning that all the hairs on the cow have to be red. That's why the rabbi was looking at the cow with a magnifying glass. They allow 2 hairs to be a different color, only 2 on the entire animal. This is what has disqualified all the potential red heifers in the past. When they were examined, they had more than 2 white hairs. The red heifer also can't have blemishes like warts or cysts or other marks. And they cannot have worn a yoke. The rabbis define this as work, which strangely also includes leaning against the heifer, because the rabbis believe that if you lean against it, the heifer has to lean back. This is the nitpicking adding to the word that it so frustrated Jesus during his ministry. But that is Judaism in today's world. We aren't going to change it. So, in my opinion, finding a kosher red heifer will be an act of God. The only way a perfect kosher one will be found, one that matches all these requirements, is if God permits it in his good timing. So when it is announced that a red heifer has been sacrificed, know that it is God's doing, and his countdown will almost assuredly have begun. After finding a kosher red heifer, God then gave Moses these additional instructions. You shall give it to Eleazar the priest, and it shall be brought outside the camp and be slaughtered in his presence. Next, Eleazar the priest shall take some of its blood with his finger and sprinkle some of its blood toward the front of the tent of meeting 7 times. This was the only sacrifice commanded to be done outside of the camp. In just a little bit, we'll explain why that was important, as well as why God instructed this strange 7 times sprinkling of blood toward the tabernacle. After the temple was built, this ceremony took place on the Mount of Olives. A bridge was built from the area of the temple across the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives. The Kidron Valley is full of graves, so this bridge allowed the priests and the cow to cross in a state of cleanliness and not be defiled. We can safely assume the future sacrifice will take place on the Mount of Olives as well. Then additional unusual things were required. The heifer shall be burned in his sight. Its hide and its flesh and its blood with its refuse shall be burned. The priest shall take cedar wood and hyssop and scarlet material and cast it into the midst of the burning heifer. Anytime I see unusual instructions like these in the Bible, they mean something, and we'll discuss that shortly. The priest shall then wash his clothes and bathe in the water, and afterward come up into the camp. But the priest shall be unclean until evening. The one who burns it shall also wash his clothes in water and bathe his body in the water, and shall be unclean until evening. The one who does the sacrifice to make the nation clean becomes unclean himself. According to the rabbis, this was the greatest of the mysteries. Why was this, they thought? Rabbis simply did not understand, but we will. Those made unclean for 7 days by this ceremony had to be purified on both the 3rd day and the 7th day by being sprinkled with water mixed with the ashes. These numbers of days are also symbolic, as we will soon see. The other verse that is read on Shabbat Parah is Ezekiel 36, 24-26. I will take you from the nations, gather you from all the lands, and bring you into your own land. Then I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your filthiness and from all your idols. Moreover, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you, and I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. This is speaking of the Messiah Jesus, who will save all of Israel that survives the great tribulation upon his second coming. And did you notice the sprinkling of water to make them clean? That's red heifer language. Rabbis teach that there have been 9 red heifers, and that the next red heifer, the 10th, will accompany the building of the 3rd temple and the coming of the Messiah. So that is why we said, watch for the red heifer. Israel believes it is a sign to begin to build the temple. But before we conclude with a date that you should mark on your calendar, let's continue to look at the symbol of the red heifer and what it's all about. It's talking about Jesus. The author of Hebrews wrote about this. For the bodies of those animals, and he's talking about the red heifers, whose blood is brought into the holy place by the high priest as an offering for sin, are burned outside the camp. Therefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people through his own blood, suffered outside the gate. The only sacrifice burned outside the camp was the red heifer. So Jesus, we are told in Hebrews, is our spiritual red heifer. In Hebrews, the author further explained, for if the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling those who have been defiled, sanctify for the cleansing of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. Jesus' blood sacrifice is the fulfillment of all the Old Testament sacrifices. Passover, the red heifer, and Yom Kippur. All of them point to Jesus. And his sacrifice as the ultimate red heifer never needs to be redone. We don't have to worry about running out of ashes. His sacrifice was once for all. One might ask, why was it necessary for Jesus to be both our Passover lamb as well as our red heifer? Human thinking would ask, wasn't one symbol enough? Now in the Jewish priesthood, you needed to be baptized or mikvahed in water mixed with the red heifer ashes to put on the white robe and enter the temple and have an open door to the Father. So it is Jesus' role as red heifer that gives us access to the Father, and further will allow us to put on white robes in heaven. After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could count, from every nation and all tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, and palm branches were in their hands. So let's ask a couple questions. Why is the heifer without spot or blemish? Jesus was our spotless lamb, and at the same time, our spotless red heifer, without sin. The heifer was examined by the priests for 3 years prior to sacrifice to make sure it was kosher. That it had less than those 2 white hairs? This 3-year examination represents the 3-year ministry of our Lord, where he proved he was sinless. Didn't Jesus ever wear a yoke? I mean, Jesus worked hard his whole life. In Bible times, Jesus told us yoke, however, was the yoke of the Pharisees, their man-made religious law that they added to the Torah. Jesus never wore their yoke. He perfectly fulfilled the Torah, but not their man-made laws. Additionally, as Jesus began to leave the city of Jerusalem to go to Calvary, he stumbled, and from that point on, his cross was carried by Simon of Cyrene. Now, some consider this was also not wearing a yoke. But why was the heifer red? You would think if Jesus is the spiritual heifer, it would be a white heifer for his purity. But it's red for 2 reasons. First, Jesus was covered with blood during his crucifixion. It was a brutal murder. But more importantly, he made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. 2 Corinthians 5:21. The sinless one took on our sins to create a right relationship with God. He made us clean. So the red heifer is red, the color of sin, and Jesus became sin for us. The red heifer was purchased by the temple for the purpose of sacrifice. Jesus was bought for 30 pieces of silver from the temple treasury, which was paid to Judas. When the sacrifice was finished, the temple was opened and the high priest had to look inside the Holy of Holies. This made it an official red heifer sacrifice. On the day of Jesus' crucifixion, a great earthquake tore the veil of the temple in two, and the high priest, whether he was sit on the Mount of Olives watching Jesus die or in the temple, heard the noise and looked into the Holy of Holies, and that authenticated the red heifer sacrifice. And after the red heifer was burned, its ashes were placed in a clean place for 3 days. This clean place was a newly hewn stone container. And after the 3 days, they would mix the ashes with living water, which meant running water or fresh water. Jesus was placed in a clean, never-used grave, a newly hewn grave, for 3 days prior to rising from the dead. And after 3 days, he was raised to life. So you have just seen a dozen similarities between Jesus and the red heifer. But we've left the most puzzling ones for last. First, why did the priest sprinkle the blood of the heifer 7 times toward the temple? There are 7 millennium, 7,000 years from Adam's fall to the end of the millennial kingdom. If you haven't seen this landmark video on the greatest prophecy ever, click on the banner. We will also leave a link down in the description if you want to watch it later. So Jesus died to make clean all of those who died in faith in the Father and faith in him during those 1,000-year periods, all 7 of them. These 1,000-year-long days, the millennial days, also explain the mysterious symbolism of the purification that takes place on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. On the 3rd day, or after 2,000 years from creation, Moses did the initial red heifer sacrifice for the purification of Israel. And on the 7th day, or after 6,000 years, Jesus will return, and he himself will be our red heifer sprinkling at that time. Returning to the idea of why there were 7 sprinklings, Jesus also had 7 wounds. 1 for each of those 1,000 years. His back was striped by a Roman whip. His head was pierced by a crown of thorns. Both of his hands were pierced by Roman spikes. Both of his feet were also pierced by spikes. And finally, his side was thrust through by a Roman spear, the final wound, and out flowed blood and water, the mixture of the red heifer, ashes mixed with living water. Absolutely amazing. Second, why was cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet wool thrown into the fire when the red heifer was burned? This wasn't some sort of magic formula. Rather, it was a picture of Jesus on the cross, nailed to a wooden beam like cedar, offered sour wine on a stalk of hyssop, and he was the scarlet lamb of God, the red wool. A beautiful picture of the coming crucifixion that none of the onlookers at Calvary really understood. So, there are 2 of the tough questions answered. Now let's answer the hardest of them all. Why does the sacrifice make all of Israel clean, yet it makes the one who burns the sacrifice, who starts out clean, into one who is unclean? The reason is because both the heifer and the priest start out clean, but in the process of the sacrifice, the heifer becomes unclean. If you remember, this is a picture of Jesus taking on the sin of the world. So the priests who start out clean become unclean as they touch the red heifer. And here is the spiritual analogy. For as many as are the works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, "Cursed is everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law to perform them." The Jewish priests were relying on the Torah to save them. But everyone who doesn't keep every single aspect of the Torah is cursed according to this verse. Obviously, only Jesus fulfilled all the law, so everyone relying on the law alone is cursed. Only by abiding in Jesus, placing your full faith in Him, can you be saved. Then He can sprinkle you and make you righteous before God. So the priests and temple officials who oversaw the death of our Messiah became unclean because they relied solely on the Torah. Now, that doesn't mean the law and the prophets are done away with, hardly. It's just that we are not to rely on them for our salvation. Jesus, the red heifer, is salvation. Now let us turn our attention to what may transpire soon, the final red heifer sacrifice, the setting up of a tent or tabernacle, and the beginning of animal sacrifices. We have already indicated the sacrifice of the red heifer is the great sign that sacrifices are about to begin. Because once the Jews have that heifer, the pressure to move forward and set up a tabernacle will be overwhelming. Just to show how the rabbis already feel this pressure, the ancient site of the sacrifice on the Mount of Olives has been tentatively located by archaeologist Jonathan Adler, so the place can easily be prepared. A practice run red heifer sacrifice took place last summer to calculate exactly how much ash was created and how much of each type of wood provided through analysis of the ash would be needed. They have it down to a science and have figured out that they have not only enough to purify every Jew in the world, but enough to go forward until another red heifer, of course, in their opinion. But a tabernacle or tent must be in place first, in my opinion. An integral part of the sacrifice is sprinkling blood 7 times in the direction of a tabernacle, so Israel has to have one, even if it's undedicated. It has to have one prior to the red heifer ceremony. And what you may not know is there are 2 apparently kosher red heifers in Israel right now. Rabbi Azariah Ariel of the Temple Institute announced it just this month. And he additionally said they are only 1 year away from being ready. That's right, 1 year. Even people who follow the red heifer closely have probably not noticed that the Jewish rabbis have moved the date up. They redefined, in a way, how old the heifer had to be. Historically, it had to be 3 years old, but they have redefined it to be acceptable in the 3rd year, which means 2 years plus at least 1 day. This means the heifer born on the 28th of August 2018 could be eligible as soon as the 29th of August of this year. The other one will be eligible sometime in early 2021. So I ask, why the urgency to move the time up? Obviously, they are hoping to do the sacrifice within a year. And that's exactly what Rabbi Ariel said. Perhaps that would place us at next year's Shabbat Parah, the Sabbath of the cow. Will the sacrifice take place on or about this day set aside to remind Israelites to purify themselves before Passover? Possibly. However, Jewish tradition gives the date of God providing Moses both the red heifer instructions and setting up the tabernacle on Nisan 1, the beginning of the religious year. So this is also a possibility and, in my opinion, a pretty auspicious date. And as we said, to have a red heifer ceremony, In my opinion, one must have a tabernacle to sprinkle 7 times in its direction. So the date of the tabernacle setup seems perfect. It's the historic date, Nisan 1. So my humble assumption is the tabernacle will be set up on the same day as the red heifer ceremony. And if that is correct, it would mean that we may be less than 1 year away from a temporary tabernacle being set up on the Temple Mount. So mark your calendars. March 5th, Shabbat Parah, up to March 14th, Nisan 1, of next year, 2021, may be the most likely range of dates for the sacrifice that we have ever had. The heifer ashes then requires 7 days of purification and would place us less than a week from Passover at that point. The Passover sacrifice might be the first to take place in the new tabernacle. I think the Jews would like that. This would be March 27th, 2021. We are not date setting this day or week. We are instructing instead everyone to watch for this most important end time sign. Remember, the timing is completely in God's hands, one way or the other. A kosher red heifer will be a miracle given all of the rabbis' regulations. So if we have a sacrifice next year, God's end time plans are on the move, I think almost assuredly. And if not, our suppositions in this end portion of the video were incorrect, and it was not God's time yet. But we need to watch. That's why we're asking you to mark your calendars. Now, in our next video, we will continue to fill in the blanks in this vision of future events surrounding the third temple that launched the Antichrist. Now, who does the Mishnah, Judaism's non-inspired oral law, say is going to burn the final red heifer and build the temple? You will be surprised. And how will this person lead us to the Antichrist? If you want to know, click right here to keep watching. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell notification so you can be notified when that new video comes out. This is Nelson, and I'll see you there.